Good morning, everyone. We will get started in about 2 minutes. We'll give everyone a chance to join today's session. Can everyone hear and see me okay? If you could just raise your virtual hand. All right, great. We'll get started in 2 minutes. For those of you who are just joining us, we are going to begin today's session in about 2 minutes. So I would take this moment to just turn off any distractions on your laptop or on your phone to treat this space like you would an in-person session. All right, good morning, everyone. We will get started. My name is Farah, and I am a clinical social worker from the US and a therapist at the Lighthouse. I specialize in working with grief, trauma, depression, and anxiety. I'm also the director of our mental health first aid program. And I love this webinar because so much of it is everything I wish I knew when I was younger. For most of us, and including myself, growing up in a Pakistani American household, no one ever said the words mental health or spoke about emotions. And years into my professional career, what I find is this has been the experience for most people around the world, that many of us have grown up in homes where mental health was synonymous with mental illness or being crazy or someone who's very sick, and emotions were not something that were discussed. And that has really resulted in adults who do not know how to identify, acknowledge, or even express emotions. And so today's talk is really about what is mental health? How is it different from mental illness? What are the prevalence rates of people who are struggling in your life and around you? And how can you recognize the signs and the difference between sadness and depression, normal worry versus an anxiety disorder? And what are the things that you can do to take care of your own mental health and mental hygiene, really? And how can you support others around you who may be struggling? So, what are the things you should say, and what are the things you should not say to do further harm? So, without further ado, I will share my screen with you. And so I'll speak for about um, maybe about 45, 50 minutes, and then we will keep the remainder of today's webinar for Q&A, so you can ask any anonymous questions that you have for me. Okay, so how many of you have heard of the Lighthouse? If you could just raise your virtual hand. Yeah, many people. So I won't spend too much time on this slide. We are an outpatient mental health clinic located in Dubai. So we're a team of 30 therapists and 3 psychiatrists who really love what they do. I think it's a calling for all of us. And we're really on a mission to destigmatize mental health in the region. So we do a lot of different free of charge support groups, and you can learn more about that on our website. Okay, so that's us in a nutshell. So, how prevalent is mental illness? Right? And remember, when I say mental illness, that's very different from mental health. Okay, every single person has mental health the same way every single person has physical health. Okay. So when we look at how common mental health problems are, we know that 1 in 4 people are currently struggling. So that means a quarter of the people on this call today, a quarter of the people on your social media, a quarter of the people on your teams. I can really confidently argue that it's more than a quarter because this number from WHO actually is pre-pandemic. We know that there are more stressors than ever in this last year, and people are really struggling. We also know that this number comes from people who have eventually sought professional help in developed countries. By developed, I mean the data is from Australia, America, the UK, Japan. If we look at help seeking behavior within even the Gulf region or other countries, we know that it's significantly less. So I can pretty confidently say it's most likely more than a quarter of the people in your life. Okay. I would say, 3 out of 4, maybe 2 out of 4. And so just bear that in mind. Okay. I want you to know that mental illnesses do not care if you are American or Lebanese or Canadian, they impact all of us equally. It does not matter whether you are a billionaire or you have 500 dirhams in your bank account right now. Mental illnesses impact all of us equally. I'll often have people say to me, but why do I feel this way? Like I have a good job, I have resources, I have a family, right? But resources do not make us immune from developing illness. The same way there are situations where the marathon runner or the Olympian will go on to develop a disease, right? We can do things to have resilient and great mental health, but no one is truly immune from things like depression or anxiety disorders or so on. Okay? We know that every 40 seconds someone dies by suicide around the world, and that it tends to be more men than women. And of all illnesses, both mental and physical, depression is the second most common disease. If we look at how disabling is it to live with certain mental illnesses, there was a very, for me, it was quite life-changing when I first saw the next slide. And what you're going to see is a side-by-side study that was looking at how disabling it is to live with mental illnesses. And by disability, they were measuring the amount of disruption any health condition has on your ability to work, carry out relationships, and function in your community. So it's quite broad. And let's look at what they found. Okay, so what they found was that living with mild depression is as disabling as living with epilepsy and more disabling than living with low back pain. Living with moderate depression is as disabling as living with severe asthma, relapsing MS, or chronic hepatitis B. Severe post-traumatic stress disorder, which is a type of anxiety disorder, we often hear this linked to veterans or anyone that has experienced trauma may be at a higher risk. It's a type of anxiety disorder. It's as disabling as living with severe chronic emphysema or bronchitis, which is a disease of the lungs. Severe PTSD is more disabling than severe vision loss, severe asthma, epilepsy, and low back pain. And we know that severe depression is as disabling as living with disseminated breast cancer. And by disseminated, I mean that the cancer has advanced or spread to other parts of the body. And severe schizophrenia, which is a type of psychotic disorder, it's more rare, is as disabling as living with severe dementia. And severe dementia and schizophrenia, they are both mental and physical illnesses, right? So I know the first time I saw this, which was, actually a very long time ago, I was quite surprised. I was quite surprised that anything could be more disabling than vision loss, right? Now, I want you to think if, hypothetical Johnson, I've just made him up. I hope no one's married to a Johnson or has a brother named Johnson. But imagine this hypothetical colleague Johnson comes to you and says, I'm really struggling with my asthma. It's super dusty and foggy outside. I'm afraid I'm going to have an asthma attack in today's team meeting. most of us may respond and say, okay, like maybe you rescheduled a meeting, check in with your doctor. Is there something we can do to support you? Now, imagine that same individual came to you and said, I'm really struggling to get out of bed today because of my depression. Most people say things like, come on, at least you're in the UAE, or come on, be grateful for what you have. Not only do we have a dismissive response, we actually have a harmful response. We are judging. And what makes it worse is for many people who have lived with depression or experienced it, they will also internally have a judgmental or dismissive response as well. Okay. So let's take a closer, let's kind of like zoom out a little bit. What do we mean when we say mental health? So mental health is not the same thing as mental illness. And I know for many of us, this has been really confusing. And there's a lot of stigma around like, oh, that person's mental means they're crazy. We all have mental health, right? It is not the same thing as mental illness. And in a nutshell, what we mean is the health of your thoughts, feelings, and behaviors. Okay? And your mental health is also very linked to your physical health. I want you to know that your mental health lives on a continuum the same way your physical health does. So some days or weeks you can have really good physical fitness. You're working out, you're eating your multivitamins, you're sleeping well, you're feeling good, right? And other weeks you can have poor physical health. You've been skipping your workouts, maybe it's hot outside, so you haven't been taking that run, and you're just not feeling as physically well. That does not mean that you've developed disease, right? And our mental health is the same. So some weeks we can have days, we can have really good mental health where you're feeling confident, optimistic, connected to the people in your life. You're feeling hopeful. And other days or weeks, you can feel cynical, low, hopeless, frustrated. And I know for many of us, there have been waves of that as we're surviving this last year. And will I be able to travel? And will I not? And what's going to happen? And all of the adjustments to working from home, right there, your mental health shifts on that continuum. That doesn't mean that you've developed depression, right? A few difficult days is different from the onset of a mental illness, and usually the onset is gradual. So when we are in a state of poor mental health for several weeks, several months, we're actually at high risk, right, of developing something like depression or anxiety disorder, right? The same way, if you knew that you weren't sleeping well and you weren't taking your vitamin and you weren't taking care of your physical health, you will also be more susceptible to getting a cold or the flu, right? And the same is true with our mental health. So when do we say that how do we know really broadly, because there's many different types of mental illnesses, that it's not just a few difficult days? And what you'll find is that when someone is struggling, or yourself, you're going to see significant changes to the way that you are thinking, feeling, or behaving. Okay. So the inner world, the inner thoughts and feelings can get quite loud, critical. The feelings can feel larger as well, where it's sadness or emptiness or inadequacy. And that loud inner world may impact the way you're behaving as well. You may be isolating yourself. You may feel more withdrawn. You may be engaging in different behaviors to try and numb or soothe what is happening inside of you. And it's not just a few off days, it's that most days begin to feel like difficult days. And for many people, they think that it's only really bad if I stop functioning, if I'm not getting my work done. Now, sometimes that may happen where you're not functioning, right? It's impacting your ability to carry out daily tasks like taking care of things around the house, or sometimes even showering can feel exhausting, right? So it can be daily tasks. It may be impacting work performance and your ability to function. It may be impacting relationships. It can be one domain or all three. But for many people who are more high functioning, work may not be impacted. But if you look at relationships or their physical health or their energy to do other things that they enjoy, there may be complete depletion. Okay, so it's most days began feeling like difficult days, and the inner world is starting to impact what's happening outside as well. So when we think of how may someone appear who's struggling, we tend to almost visualize Eeyore. Does everyone know who Eeyore is? He's a character from Pooh. If you could just raise your hand. And he really represents depression quite well. If you say to him, "Good morning, Eeyore," he says things like, yeah, right. It's most likely not going to be a good morning. Very pessimistic, very cynical. Now, the thing is, sometimes when someone is struggling with their mental health, they may appear this way. They may be tearful and withdrawn and cynical, and that may be a little bit easier to catch. But oftentimes, this is not the case, right? So it can be that bubbly individual, that high performing individual. I think of people like Martin Luther King, who's a famous American civil rights leader. He had 2 suicide attempts as a teenager and struggled with depression throughout his life. Princess Diana struggled with anxiety and an eating disorder. Michael Phelps is the most decorated Olympic swimmer, and he has talked about his struggle with uh, anxiety and suicidal thoughts. Dwayne Johnson, depression, and Elon Musk, the CEO of Tesla, has talked about his struggle with anxiety. So, again, these are not the initial images that come to mind when we think of how may someone appear who is struggling. So, I really want to challenge that because you can be looking at yourself or others in your life and thinking, well, they look like they have it all together. But the nature of our mental health is very invisible. You can be struggling with anxiety, but appear very confident. You can be having suicidal thoughts, but show up to work and appear to be fine and functional. You could have had a panic attack just moments before going into a meeting or putting on a webinar, although that didn't happen. I'm okay, guys. But again, it can be deceiving. Someone who is battling depression can be funny and joking. So you may be thinking of like Robin Williams. There was a lot of shock when he died by suicide. You can be deemed the team player by others, but internally feel a sense of inadequacy or worthlessness. And you can be in senior leadership, director level, CEO, but internally feel a sense of being a fraud or an imposter. Okay? So again, I love this iceberg visual, which is the nature of what happens inside of us is very, very invisible. Okay. I want you to know that our mental health is inextricably connected to our physical health as well. So our mind and our body are they're almost always communicating. They share a neurochemical language. So there's actually many studies done, but one that was really shocking was they looked at the impact of untreated depression on individuals living with cancer. And what they found was that if there was cancer and if you looked at, there were 2 groups. So there was cancer and depression and cancer and no depression and without treatment. And what they found is that when it was left untreated, those individuals lived up to 10 years shorter lives. If you look at depression and its impact on chronic pain, you'll see the worsening of chronic pain. And there are actually several studies looking at the impact of depression and anxiety on stroke, on blood pressure, and it really has quite a poor impact. So we always want to treat both. And you can imagine if you've had a day when you've gotten into a fight with someone you love, your spouse, or you've gotten difficult feedback, you can imagine when you kind of leave that meeting or that moment, you kind of like feel tired, or your stomach may be upset, or you may sit differently. Like our mind and our body are always communicating, and vice versa, right? Like, so if you have a cold or you're feeling exhausted, or if you've had COVID, you kind of feel low as well. So they're always communicating, it's very connected. The dream with mental health care is early intervention. So the sooner we can catch the onset of illness, the better the health outcome. So the same is true with like catching diabetes earlier, catching cancer care earlier. Earlier is always better. But one of an alarming statistic I recently read was that majority of individuals will have their first episode of, let's say, depression or an anxiety disorder at the age of 14. It then goes untreated for typically 10 years, 8 to 10 years, before they ever seek professional help. So I want you to imagine being like 14 to 15 years old and thinking, for 8 to 10 years, gosh, I just need to be faster, stronger, better. What's wrong with me? Right? Imagine how that's going to impact your self-esteem, your grades, your relationships, the choices you make in going on to university, right? It's quite alarming. All right, so what are some risk factors? What are some things that will make you or others more likely to experience a mental illness? Okay, so if you have a family history, and I'll just say that if you're in a state of poor mental health, and a really good question actually is, what is poor mental health? So if you tend to be really hard on yourself, if you tend to be quite neglectful towards your inner world, I want you to imagine, and I'll say this later too, you are in a relationship with yourself, right? With your thoughts and feelings. And if you're in a respectful, attuned relationship with you, you're going to have good mental health. If you never check in, that means you have a neglectful relationship with yourself, right? So imagine if you said, I'm in a marriage where we never ask each other how we are or how we're feeling or our hopes or our dreams. You're going to say there's actually quite a disconnect there. And that's also true between you and you. Okay. So poor mental health, you can also see cynicism and a harsh inner critic. Now, if that exists, if you're frequently in a state of poor mental health, when a risk factor comes along in your life, it's almost like kicking a pre-existing sprained ankle, right? And that usually tends to tip people into a depressive episode or an anxiety disorder. So that's something to keep in mind. So if you have a family history, right? And for many people, they actually have no idea that, like if we go back a generation, many parents and grandparents are undiagnosed actually. So be curious if you have a family history, if you're living with any physical illnesses, hormonal imbalances, thyroid issues, vitamin D, many side effects for acne medication or fertility medication can sometimes be the root cause why someone's mood is actually quite disrupted. Okay. So psychological risk factors, low self-esteem, if you're quite hard on yourself, that inner belief of inadequacy. And remember, many people can be what we call, this isn't a clinical word, but this kind of insecure overachiever that can actually be quite high performing, but is driven by a fear of failure and inadequacy. That is a risk factor, right? When you're being governed by fear as opposed to being governed by your values, okay? If you tend to be quite cynical, if there is a history of trauma or abuse, and so if you look at so many people that I have worked with actually have unacknowledged childhood trauma. That is also a risk factor. And when we say childhood trauma, the kind of obvious ones are going to be things like physical abuse, sexual abuse, physical neglect, emotional neglect. Those are the ones that tend to be obvious in our mind. But there are other types of childhood trauma. We call them ACEs. So they're adverse childhood experiences. And these are things like divorce, death of a loved one, a parent with a physical or mental illness, a parent that is incarcerated, witnessing domestic violence. A huge move can also be a stressor for a child. If there's been addiction in the family, these are also part of adverse childhood experiences and childhood trauma. And what you find is that if an individual has 3 to 4 of these experiences, the trauma or the ACEs, they are 12 times more likely to experience depression or anxiety disorders into adulthood. And if there are 5 or more, they are 4,000 times more likely to experience certain types of addiction into adulthood. So really, time does not heal all wounds, right? Trauma actually changes our biology long into adulthood. You're also, childhood trauma is also one of the most significant predictors of stroke, cardiovascular disease, diabetes, and other illnesses. Okay. I have like a special passion for trauma, so I just went off on a tangent there. Other risk factors will be if you're grieving, if you have a tendency of comparing yourself to others, which everyone is doing on social media right now. I don't think I've met anyone that says, like, I've just gotten off social media and I'm so happy for everyone. I see comparison as like it actually lowers your emotional immune system. Okay. So, social risk factors can be being an expat. So, many of us are away from familiar support from family, experiencing a pandemic, loneliness, bullying, if you experience racism or discrimination, a history of poverty or war, those would also be ACEs if they're part of your childhood experience. Unstable political environment, if you're going through a divorce or a breakup, legal or financial issues. And I'll also add lifestyle risk factors. If you tend to be sleep deprived, right? So if you're sleeping, can I see a number of hands? How many people slept less than 7 hours last night? Oh no, a lot of people. Okay. So sleep deprivation is if you're sleeping less than 7 hours, and I mean 7 hours of uninterrupted sleep, okay? That that like if you came into my office for counseling and you hadn't slept, I'd say go to sleep. The single most effective thing you can do for your mental and physical health is to sleep well. Okay, that's a really important starting point. Not that people sleep in my office, but you get what I mean, right? So, sleep is so important. If you are not eating well or exercising, these are all lifestyle risk factors. If you're drinking a lot of coffee and you're anxious, that is going to worsen your anxiety. So these are all risk factors. Okay. Now, I want you to be mindful that Johnson may have a family history of depression, be super perfectionistic, have low self esteem, and going through a divorce, but not experience depression. But there's a lot of risk, right? And when there's a lot of risk in your life, you really want to up your self care and some of those pillars of emotional hygiene that I'll get to. So, we're now going to take a closer look at depression and anxiety because these are the most common types of mental illnesses, although they are not the only. Okay. So, what is clinical depression? Does anyone in today's webinar like Harry Potter? If you could just raise your hand. A few people. Okay, I know there's some controversy around her lately. So in Harry Potter, there are these creatures called Dementors, and they are these black shadowy creatures. They look like what I imagine a jinn would look like, which are like Muslim demon creature things. And when they come near Harry Potter, it's like white light leaves his mouth. And he says, it's like all joy and all happy memories have left my body. And we know that the author has described these creatures as depression because depression is not just feeling low or sad. At most, it's feeling completely numb, empty, and devoid of emotion altogether. And I really think it's such a common disease, and I would say it's one of the worst diseases. And I say that as a therapist that also works with health trauma. There's something really magnificent about how humans think and operate. That with many physical illnesses, you will still have moments of being able to perhaps enjoy a moment with a loved one or enjoy a meal, or even the anticipation of when I feel better, I will travel, or I'll do this again, or I'll try this again, or I'll connect differently. There's even the anticipation of joy. Now, with depression, I want you to imagine everything you do that makes you feel loved, connected, good, like connecting with your loved ones, or playing a sport, or cooking, or food, or, for me, I love watching Oprah videos, or imagine all of those things, doing them and feeling nothing, not being able to experience joy. It's actually quite horrific. And when we look at what happens when we do fMRI scans on the brain of individuals experiencing depression, right? when someone says to you, I'm in pain emotionally, I don't feel well, I feel heavy, they're actually not being abstract. They're being really specific, because the brain shows us that when we experience emotional pain, the same centers of our brain light up when we're experiencing physical pain. So they're actually being quite specific. And yes, many people who experience depression may be lethargic. They may be feeling exhausted a lot of the times. But if you look at the hormone levels inside a depressed individual, you actually see that they're going into fight or flight a lot. And there are high levels of the stress hormone cortisol and adrenaline. Also, if you look at the sleep structure, our sleep is actually really sophisticated. But when we are experiencing depression, the entire architecture of your sleep changes. And I name these points because depression is a biological illness in addition to psychological. Because when we say like, yeah, Johnson, just, be more positive, it's actually really harmful. So it is a medical illness. It needs to be diagnosed by a GP or a mental health professional. There must be at least 2 weeks of most days feeling like difficult days. But we know that this can go on for months or even years. The longer it goes untreated, the more we risk it getting worse. You may see tearfulness, you may not. You may see more of like a flat, empty mood. You may see that it's hard to concentrate. Really, really common in men and in teens will be irritability and anger. You may see oversleeping or undersleeping, overeating or undereating, feeling excessively guilty or inadequate when really not at fault. So I always describe depression like being in an abusive relationship with yourself, where there's that harshness. Okay. And depression can range from mild, moderate, and severe. So with more mild to moderate depression, you can have an ambivalence towards life or death, like, I just don't really care if something happened to me. Now, with more severe depression, you can actually have suicidal thoughts or a plan. So, just as a summary, what is the difference between normal sadness and depression? So, we all experience sadness, right? And remember, good mental health is not about, being happy all the time. That's just not true. There's no such thing as negative emotions, they're all neutral, right? And so, if you're feeling sad about perhaps you didn't travel over the summer, or you're feeling sad, you're like, I can't believe we're still like wearing masks in 2021. That's a healthy, understandable emotion to experience, right? Now, depression is going to be like, so if I'm feeling sad about, still wearing a mask, I'm still going to enjoy speaking to my sister, or taking a walk, or listening to music. I'm still taking pleasure in these things. With depression, that's not happening anymore. You're seeing a lessening of that, or an absence of it. And you're seeing more major changes. So if I'm feeling sad one day because, I'm like, gosh, we're still in this pandemic, maybe I'm a little bit quieter that day. Maybe I'm a little bit withdrawn. But with depression, it's going to be major changes. Now, depression can be triggered by something specific, but the onset can also be for no particular reason at all. Okay. You never ever see suicidal thoughts or behaviors with uh, normal sadness. I don't like this word normal, or I'll just say common sadness. All right. So we're going to now switch to anxiety. And before we speak about what clinical anxiety is, I'll speak about what anxiety is, because we all have anxiety. It's actually a very normal human emotion, right? So, for example, if you have a deadline coming up and you're feeling a bit anxious, it's actually your body's way of saying, okay, we care about this, right? So, like Michael Phelps feels a bit anxious before he goes on, a healthy dose. If you feel a bit anxious before you go grocery shopping, you're like, I hope there's not too many people there. That's also understandable. Zero anxiety may mean that you're like shaking people's hands and like hugging them and you're not wearing a mask. That's not good. Don't do that. So we all have anxiety and it's functional. Now, there's another stress response in our body that is more extreme and also helpful. And that is the fight or flight response. So if you're in the grocery store and it appears as though someone's approaching you and they're about to sneeze on you, your fight or flight response will most likely be activated. And your body is saying, there's a threat here. So either we prepare to attack this person, fight, or we run away. Okay. And how your body prepares you for that threat is it surges out cortisol and adrenaline, the stress hormones. Your heart starts pumping blood to all of your major muscle organs. Okay. Any system that is not needed to fight or flight shuts down, digestion, fertility. You don't need to feel your fingertips either, right? So, like, you may feel the blood rushing away from your toes and fingers and a numbness. Your frontal lobe shuts down. You do not need higher order strategic thinking in that moment. Okay. So all of this is happening in your body, and it's really helpful when there's a threat. You think someone may attack you or something bad may happen. But humans are the only creatures that can think their way into a panic. So you may be sitting in this webinar and maybe you like have like a little bump on your arm and you like Google it, and Google, Dr. Google says it may be cancer. And you're like, oh my God, I may have cancer. And immediately that thought can actually trigger a fight or flight response while you're sitting at home, right? So the very thought, no one likes me, or I'm going to die, or I'm going to lose my job, that thought can actually activate the fight or flight response in our physical body. And so the hallmark symptom of someone struggling with an anxiety disorder is that the level of fear or worry does not match the situation. So imagine you're going to meet a friend for coffee, but the level of fear or worry you experience is like you're about to present to 1,000 people. Okay, that is what an anxiety disorder can feel like. And it can be triggered by something specific, but not necessarily. Many people can wake up with that sense of that dread. And imagine relaxing in your home, but feeling like you're about to go take an exam. It's actually a really uncomfortable feeling to have, and it can be quite debilitating for people. Okay. Now, I want you to know that the most severe form of anxiety can be a panic attack, which is also a mental health crisis. Okay, there are many different types of anxiety disorders. You don't need to know those. We're not going into those. But as you can imagine, the symptoms of anxiety are super physical, right? So pounding heart, chest pain, dizziness, headache, sweating. Really commonly will be stomach or digestive issues. Muscle aches and pains. And if you tend to be quite disconnected from your mind and your thoughts, your body really communicates to you. Be like, I'm tired, I don't feel well, I'm not good, my stomach's upset. You may see a racing mind, jumping to the worst case scenario, catastrophizing. And many people, it can be fight, flight, or freeze. So feeling like it's hard to concentrate, feeling paralyzed. And most people don't say, I'm anxious. They'll say, I feel on edge, I'm stressed, right? Specific phobias are also a type of anxiety disorders, but I'm not going to get into that right now. All right. So as a summary, what is the difference between normal worry versus an anxiety disorder? Okay, we all have normal worry, right? And it's usually triggered by something specific, a deadline, an exam. It says missed flight. Clearly, I made this chart before the pandemic because I know not many of us have been on a flight, but maybe something is coming up that has triggered some anxiety. Clinical anxiety, it can be triggered by a specific situation, but it doesn't have to be. Okay. If I'm feeling worried about a deadline coming up or a project, I may be thinking about it a little bit more, minor changes. With clinical anxiety, it's going to be significant. Maybe I'm not sleeping, maybe I'm not taking care of other parts of my life. It's major, and it's most days feel like difficult days. You will also see a very loud inner critic with clinical anxiety, okay? Very similar to depression, actually. But a lot of the predominant feeling with anxiety is fear or worry, and the predominant feeling with depression will be a low, flat, or empty mood. But there's similarities between the two, right? You never ever see suicidal thoughts with normal worry. That can be a symptom of clinical anxiety. All right. So, my favorite part, I'll probably speak for about another 10 minutes on the things you can do to have good mental health, how to support someone else, and then I'll take some questions. Okay. So, emotional hygiene. So, this first point you already know, but I'm going to say it again. The foundation. So, think of like Burj Khalifa, the foundation. If the foundation was not good, you cannot build a structure on top. Your foundation is sleep, getting at least 7 hours of sleep, exercise, water, and nutrition. So if your mood has been disrupted, start with your sleep. Okay, that's a good place to start. Another thing I want you to know is that you are in a relationship with yourself. It is the most important relationship you will ever be in. Okay. And so I want you to get really curious about beginning to observe, what type of relationship am I in with myself? Am I in a respectful relationship with myself? Am I in an abusive relationship with myself? How do I respond to myself when I make a mistake? You know, like if you were managing someone and they made a mistake, would you be like, what's wrong with you? Why did you do that? Or would you hold them accountable with respect and compassion? Like, yes, okay, that wasn't the best decision, but how can we improve from that? Or are you in a completely neglectful relationship where you never acknowledge how you're feeling? Okay. This is one of the greatest predictors of your mental health. If you're in an unhealthy relationship with yourself, okay? So I want you to start with getting really curious and observing, how do I speak to myself? What does this look like? And would I speak to someone I love or respect the way that I'm speaking to myself? And if the answer is no, then I need you to start working on that and working towards responding to you the way you would respond to them. Okay. Because remember, you experience thought, right? You are not your thoughts. So our mind is a machine. It's like constantly going. It's like, what's happening? Is this what's going on with this webinar? What does she mean by that? Or I'm hungry. The mind is always producing thought, but you are the observer who watches those thoughts. There's two streams of consciousness, right? The thinking mind and the observing mind. Some people call this the seat of the soul. And this is the foundation of mindfulness as well. Okay. You experience thought. And the analogy I love is the the sky experiences the weather, right? But the sky is always there, whether it's cloudy or sunny or raining. So we experience different thought forecasts, if you will, but you are not your thoughts. You experience them. So start noticing, how do I respond to myself? What type of relationship am I in with myself? And what I find is that, and what the research shows us, is that when people start getting curious about their emotions, that people tend to only know three emotions: happy, sad, and angry. These are not the only three emotions, okay? And I'm going to show you, I'm going to go back to that wheel. I want you to get really curious about building emotional granularity. What am I actually feeling? What emotions are coming up for me? Because anger is secondary. And anger is never an emotion that comes first. You know, underneath the anger could be, I felt disrespected, I felt rejected, I felt inadequate. So start building this EQ really. And I want you to pay attention to emotional pain. This is a part of emotional hygiene. It's also a part of emotional intelligence. So if you notice a disturbance in you, anger, sadness, irritability, numbness, confusion, get really curious about it. The same way, if you chronically had stomach pain and you said, gosh, like, why is this stomach pain here? Like, is it what I'm eating? Is it the time of day I'm eating? We would start investigating. I also need you to start investigating if you frequently find yourself resentful, sad, you know, feeling loneliness, feeling inadequate, and start investigating that. You can also, of course, investigate that with a counselor as well, to say, let's take a closer look at this emotion. How long have you been feeling this way? Okay. This is all a part of good emotional health and emotional hygiene. All right. So other tenets of emotional hygiene is giving yourself permission to feel your feelings. And this goes against like what most of us have learned. Most of us have been taught, okay, like don't let emotion cloud your judgment, or, emotions are meant to be felt, not thought through. So thinking them through is good, but that's only one tool. They're meant to be felt and released. So how you do that quite practically, because people always say like, what do you mean? How do I feel my feelings? So imagine your emotional or inner forecast today was sadness. You're like, oh, I just feel like sad and like disengaged. You notice it and you can get curious about it for 30 seconds or 1 minute. Where do I experience the sadness in my physical body? What's coming up for me right now? You may say, I feel it in my heart, I feel it in my stomach. You can also get creative. If it were a forecast, what does it look like? If it were a painting, what color is it? And what we find is that when you feel your feeling, right, you're going to process it actually more quickly and effectively. But also, when you respond to yourself with compassion, you activate the tend and befriend system in your brain. Right? And what happens is that when we respond with compassion and respect, it actually begins to soothe our stress response in our body. So it's really important. Okay? Another thing I want you to be doing is limiting caffeine and alcohol. Okay, so if you're anxious and you drink caffeine, it is going to exacerbate anxiety and the stress response. So you don't want to have caffeine. You also do not want to be watching the news when you are feeling anxious or stressed or even low. This is how we actually do more harm. And when you're not feeling well, we almost want to eliminate what are the things, places, spaces, or people that actually are hard for me to speak to be around when I'm not feeling well. And we need to eliminate those things and move them away from you. Okay, so be curious about that. I also would encourage you to be explicit about what do I need today from myself and from others around me. And it may be your partner or it may be your manager. And be explicit about asking them and saying, I need, flexible hours tomorrow, or I need a day off, or I need you to help me with this. Because our managers, our leaders, our partners, I promise you, they're not mind readers. Right. And we often get frustrated. We'll say, like, why don't they know? They should know by now. It's really important for your mental health and the psychological safety of organizations that you are explicitly asking for what you need. And it is a skill. Okay. Another thing I will say, of course, is to explore counseling. If you are more curious about how do I integrate these things, or why do I struggle with doing some of these things, then of course, counseling is a space to reflect that. Okay. And this one may sound really obvious, breathe. But I will say that when we are stressed, you may not notice that your breathing becomes very shallow. So, really, a gift you can give your physical body and your mental health is to take a deep belly breath. So I'll encourage all of you right now to take a deep breath with me. So that's in through your nose and out through your mouth. So that is actually really important for your emotional hygiene, right? Because when you're stressed, breathing gets shallow. So take intentional, conscious breaths throughout the day. And again, these are evidence-based suggestions. Another really important pillar of not only good mental health, but great mental health, when we look at positive psychology, is to celebrate small victories, to really savor them. So when something goes well in a project or in your day, or you're like, you know what, I'm really happy that like I did that. That's been hard for me. I've been really struggling with that task. Celebrating small victories is how you savor success. Okay. Otherwise, we're on this, what we call this hedonic treadmill of perpetually not feeling good enough. So it's really important that you're savoring and acknowledging things that are going well in your life intentionally. Okay. So lastly, I'm going to really quickly have like 2 more slides. If you're thinking about how to speak to someone who's having a difficult day or struggling with their mental health, how to speak to others, but I'm also like secretly how to speak to yourself as well, because I find that we can be our harshest critics. Things you do not want to say, okay, that really fall under toxic positivity and sympathy. And remember, sympathy is very different from empathy. Sympathy is superficial empathy. It's like I kind of feel what you're feeling, but like from afar, like, oh, I feel so bad for you. Okay. Empathy is feeling with, being curious. So we don't want to say things like, oh, it could have been worse, like just be positive. It's all in your head. Stop being so negative. Don't ever give up. Be strong. I'm mindful that most people say the things on this page. So be compassionate to yourself. Saying things like, don't feel that way. You shouldn't feel that way. That's actually a dismissive response, okay? Rather than acknowledging how I'm feeling, or saying things like, oh, don't feel that way. You have to be strong for your family. You have to be strong for others, is again dismissive. And empathy never ever begins with at least. Like, come on, at least you have a good job. At least you're in Dubai. That's not helpful. That's dismissive. Okay. So, more helpful, empathic response that you can have will be, I'm sure it's hard to feel positive in a situation like this if someone discloses something to you. Okay. I can't imagine what this has been like for you. I'm here to listen if you'd like to talk. This is really tough or hard. I'm here with you. You may even say, I don't know what to say, but I'm just so glad you shared with me how you are doing. What has this week or month been like for you? What can we do to support you this week or month? And this is really important. So if you have someone on your teams that is struggling with their mental health, there's really no one size fits all approach to how you should respond. You really want to encourage them to tell you what they need so you can then look at that together and see if it's reasonable. Okay. And encourage self-care. So ask them, what have you been doing to take care of yourself this week or this month? Okay. And I'm just kind of jumping back here. I hope you're not saying any of these things to yourself, right? Because the way you treat yourself will also be the way you treat others, right? Because our relationship with ourselves is mirrored in our relationship with others. So if you numb your inner world, you will lead numb. You will respond to others numb. If you're harsh with yourself, you will lean towards being harsh with others as well. So really, not to sound cliche, but really it does start with you and you, right? So things that you can do, like action steps I encourage you to take from this webinar, is to make sure you're not spreading any misinformation about mental health, to not be judgmental towards others, to not turn a blind eye. If you notice you are struggling or someone in your life on your teams is, okay, be mindful of where your knowledge, skills, and gaps are around mental health. And yes, we all have to be mindful that we do impact other people's mental health with what we do not say or the things that we do say. I want you to think about how you can advocate for better mental health care in your organization, in your families. Have conversations about how people are really doing, okay? Share that you've attended this webinar today and speak about the things that you've learned. Start a conversation about it. Many people will often share their own story. That can be so inspiring, especially if you're in a managerial or a leadership position, to say, I've been to counseling or I've struggled with depression, and it's okay to reach out for support. That can really destigmatize help seeking. You may also go on to take a mental health first aid training, and it's equivalent to physical first aid, but for mental health. So you learn how to identify and respond to depression, suicidal thoughts, anxiety disorders, panic attacks, and the severe effects of substance abuse and addiction. Okay, so you can learn more about that on our website. But really, the most important one is the most foundational, transformational step you can take is to take better care of your own mental health, okay? Because there really is no true health without mental health as well. All right, so I'm going to stop sharing, and I just have a few minutes, but I'd like to take a few questions. So if you can just pop them into the Q&A. So we have a question about antidepressants. What are your thoughts on antidepressants? Um, so two thoughts. One is, for many people, an antidepressant and medication is a really important part of their treatment plan. Now, the evidence will tell us that the best treatment outcomes for depression are often, especially for more moderately severe to severe, will be medication and therapy, right? So both should be happening together. Now, if you look at for more mild to moderate depression, we know that exercise and sleep hygiene can be as effective as an antidepressant, right? I know that there can be a lot of I see this a lot with clients, a lot of fear around medication. What does this mean? A feeling of inadequacy or like a feeling of failure. But medication can be a very important part of treatment. Antidepressants are not addictive medication. And of course, to check in with a psychiatrist and a professional to get more information about whether that needs to be a part of your treatment plan or not. So, a question is, can anxiety be cured, or anxiety disorders be cured on their own, or we need a professional therapist? So, I would say that, many people, if you see them, cut out caffeine and with exercise and with different books and their support system, you may see that the anxiety subsides, right? Now, sometimes a depressive episode can also subside on its own, but I would be extremely concerned about doing that, right? And why I say that is um, a few things. One is we're risking that without treatment, it continues to get worse. But also, once you've had one episode of an anxiety disorder or depression, you're significantly more likely to experience another one. And so, part of your time with the counselor is also what we say, like, relapse prevention. So, how do I identify the signs that I may be on the verge of struggling again? So, like, the storm is on the horizon, so that it doesn't turn into a hurricane. And how do I, if this resurfaces, how do I take care of myself, right? So we're able to build a robust toolkit of supporting the individual. So I would also say to not go at it alone. Imagine if someone came to you and said, I think I can just manage my diabetes without checking in with a professional. You're like, but why not check in with a professional? They're trained and specialized in supporting you in this journey. So I'm always curious, why not check in with a professional? Because as therapists, we're here not only to manage crisis, right? You can always proactively check in with a counselor as well. We had an anonymous attendee say the sleep lecture last week helped a lot. Okay, that's good. So if you haven't watched that, you can find it on YouTube. Are there different levels to depression? Yeah, so there's mild, moderate, and severe, and you never want to self-diagnose, right? You must be diagnosed and check in with a professional. But these are just some information that I wanted you to have, right? So thank you, everyone, for taking the time to invest in learning more about mental health. I hope that you do something lovely for your own inner world today. And thank you. Have a lovely week. Bye, everyone. You will receive a recording and a handout with key takeaways. Thank you. Bye, everyone.